Racist cop demeans black woman on plane, stunned when she becomes the pilot. Welcome, dear reader, to a story that begins not with a bang, but with a quiet entrance and a judgmental glance. Imagine yourself settled into a plush, leather seat in the exclusive forward cabin of a commercial airliner. The air is conditioned to a comfortable temperature, the lighting is soft, and the general atmosphere speaks of privilege and smooth, uneventful travel. Passengers, dressed in business attire or expensive casual wear, are finding their assigned places, stowing sleek carry-on bags, and exchanging polite, understated greetings. This is a world of quiet expectations, where certain appearances are anticipated. This is the first piece of our puzzle, a seemingly ordinary moment that holds within it the seeds of conflict and revelation. Among these passengers sits Jack Rowley, mid-50s, broad-shouldered, with close-cropped salt and pepper hair and eyes that have seen too much and judged often. His posture is straight, almost rigid, speaking of long habit and authority. Dressed in a crisp shirt and slacks, he projects an air of understated power. He is, after all, a federal agent, a former decorated police detective, en route to Washington, D.C. to receive an honor for years of dedicated, often difficult service. Jack believes he understands the world, understands people, and has a keen eye for anything out of place. As he settles into seat 2B, by the aisle, his eyes perform a practiced sweep of the cabin, assessing, categorizing, filing away observations. He anticipates a quiet, comfortable flight, a brief respite before the formality of the ceremony awaiting him. The flow of passengers down the aisle slows. Then, a figure appears at the entrance to the first-class cabin, drawing Jack's gaze. It is a woman, black, dressed in a sharp, tailored black pantsuit. She walks with a measured, confident pace, her expression calm, her eyes perhaps a little weary, but certainly not uncertain. There is an undeniable presence about her, a quiet strength that seems at odds with the immediate flicker of surprise, then irritation, that crosses Jack's face. In his mind, she simply did not fit the picture. The expensive suit was right, perhaps, but something else about her presence, her very being in this exclusive space, felt incorrect to him. It was a knee-jerk reaction, one honed over decades of profiling and making snap judgments, often based on superficial cues. She stops at his row, his seat. Jack watches her, his initial polite, neutral expression hardening into a definite frown. His eyes narrowed slightly, performing that familiar, intrusive scan from head to toe. His internal monologue, though silent, was loud with doubt and prejudice. Asterisk here? In first class? What's she doing here? Asterisk. The woman, seemingly oblivious or perhaps simply choosing to ignore the scrutiny, proceeds to seat 2A, the window seat next to Jack. She handles her small, elegant carry-on bag efficiently, lifting it easily into the overhead compartment. Her movements are economical, practiced. Then, she sits down, settling into the luxurious seat with a quiet sigh that might have been relief or simple weariness. She did not meet Jack's gaze, focusing instead on fastening her seatbelt. The proximity was immediate and, for Jack, uncomfortable. Sharing an armrest, breathing the same air in this confined, privileged space felt, to him, like an intrusion. The quiet click of her seatbelt was loud in the suddenly charged atmosphere between them. The tension was palpable, a silent acknowledgement of the invisible barrier Jack had instantly erected. Unable to contain his discomfort and the certainty of his own judgment, Jack turned and signaled impatiently to a passing flight attendant. His hand motion was sharp, demanding attention. When the young flight attendant, looking polite and harried as she managed boarding, approached, Jack spoke. His voice was deliberately loud, carrying slightly over the general background hum of the cabin, ensuring that not only the flight attendant but also several nearby passengers could hear him clearly. "Excuse me," Jack said, his tone dripping with condescension. He gestured towards the woman sitting next to him. "I think she is in the wrong seat." The flight attendant, a polite young woman with a forced smile, turned to the woman in 2A. Before she could speak, Jack continued, his voice rising slightly, adding insult to his initial statement. "This is first class," he stated, as if the woman couldn't possibly know that. Then, pausing for a fraction of a second to let the implication sink in, he added, his voice lowering slightly but still carrying the sting of contempt, "Not the service area." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken prejudice. The phrase service area was a thinly veiled reference to the service staff on the plane, many of whom were people of color. It was a deliberate, cruel jab, meant to put the woman in her perceived place. The woman in 2A, however, showed no outward reaction to the blatant insult. Her face remained calm, almost serene. She didn't even look at Jack. Instead, she calmly reached into the inner pocket of her suit jacket and produced her boarding pass. Without a word, she simply extended her hand, offering the ticket to the now visibly flustered flight attendant. The flight attendant took the ticket, her eyes flicking nervously between Jack and the woman. She leaned closer, scanning the details on the small card. The silence stretched, tense and awkward. Several other passengers in the surrounding seats had turned their heads, their expressions ranging from mild curiosity to discomfort and disapproval of Jack's behavior. The flight attendant's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. She double-checked the ticket, then looked at the seat number again. There was no mistake. The ticket clearly stated, Seat 2A, First Class. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of the woman's lips. It was a quiet smile, not of amusement, but of a deep private knowledge, perhaps even a quiet triumph over yet another small act of discrimination. She still said nothing, her silence speaking volumes. Jack, observing this, felt a surge of irritation. He wasn't finished. The ticket must be fake, or stolen, or a mistake. He wasn't about to let his initial assessment be so easily dismissed. "Maybe she found someone's ticket," Jack pressed on, his voice now slightly lower, more conspiratorial, directed at the flight attendant, but still loud enough for the woman and others to hear. His eyes bore into the flight attendant, silently urging her to see things his way. "She doesn't look like the kind of person who could afford a ticket like this." The naked prejudice in his words was unmistakable now. It wasn't just about the seat. It was about who he believed should be able to afford such a seat, who belonged in this space. The tension in the cabin became palpable, thick and uncomfortable, as tense as a guitar string. As the saying goes, some passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, avoiding eye contact. The flight attendant, caught in the middle, offered the ticket back to the woman. She looked at Jack, then back at the woman, her face a mask of professional apology mixed with embarrassment. "I am very sorry for the misunderstanding, madam," the flight attendant said softly to the woman. To Jack, she offered a brief, placating look before moving away, eager to escape the awkward confrontation. Jack's face flushed red with anger and frustration. He had been publicly, albeit subtly, corrected. He leaned back in his seat, arms crossed tightly across his chest. His jaw was clenched. He said nothing further, but his eyes, filled with unconcealed contempt and simmering resentment, remained fixed on the woman beside him. He shot daggers with his gaze, a silent, furious protest. His body language screamed his displeasure and his certainty that there was still something wrong, something deceitful about this situation. The boarding process was nearing completion. The cabin door remained open for just a few more moments. Suddenly, the woman in seat 2A unbuckled her seatbelt. She stood up, her movements deliberate and fluid. Jack watched her, a flicker of surprise returning to his eyes, quickly replaced by a smug, triumphant smirk. She was leaving the seat. She was in the wrong place, after all. His instinct, his judgment was correct. She was going to move to the back, or perhaps even be escorted off the plane. He felt a wave of vindication wash over him. His mouth curved into a small, self-satisfied smile. Without a glance at Jack, without a word to anyone, the woman began walking forward, towards the front of the aircraft, past the galley, past the lavatory, heading somewhere else. Jack's smile widened. He leaned back fully, the picture of arrogant satisfaction. He had won. The moment of awkwardness was over, and his initial prejudiced assessment had, in his mind, been proven correct. He settled in, ready for his quiet, comfortable flight. The door to the aircraft sealed shut with a solid thud, a sound that signaled the final commitment to the journey ahead. Jack Rowley leaned back in his seat, the leather cool against his back. A sense of smug satisfaction settled over him. The woman had left, just as he'd predicted. His initial read, his gut feeling, honed by years on the force, had been correct. She didn't belong in this section, and now she was gone. He allowed himself a small, private smile. It was a minor validation, perhaps, but in his world, being right was everything. He adjusted his tie, anticipation building for his arrival in D.C. and the recognition he was due. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, and the flight attendants moved efficiently through the aisles, completing their final safety checks. Outside the window next to seat 2A, which now remained conspicuously empty, the ground crew finalized their tasks, signals flashing. The aircraft began to stir, a low growl emanating from its powerful engines. A gentle pushback from the gate, a slow, deliberate movement that signaled the true start of the journey. The plane began its slow taxi towards the runway, the massive machine rumbling beneath them. Jack watched the airport buildings slide past the window across the aisle. His thoughts drifted comfortably to the ceremony awaiting him. He pictured the medal, the handshake with officials, the acknowledgement of his service. He felt a sense of accomplishment, the culmination of a career marked by tough decisions and upholding order. Then, a voice came over the intercom. Clear, professional, and distinctly female. It was the pilot. Voice. Over intercom, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is your captain speaking. Welcome aboard Flight 714 to Washington, D.C. Jack's complacent thoughts halted. He had expected a male voice. Most pilots were men, weren't they? Especially the captain. A slight furrow returned to his brow, a tiny crack in his armor of satisfaction. It was a fleeting thought, easily dismissed. There were female pilots, of course. Not many, but some. My name is Captain Amelia Brooks, and I will be your pilot for this flight. On behalf of the entire crew, I'd like to wish you a safe and pleasant journey. We are currently taxiing to the runway and expect to be airborne shortly. Our estimated flight time to Washington is approximately 1 hour and 15 minutes. The weather en route is clear, and we anticipate a smooth ride. The name hung in the air. Amelia Brooks. Jack froze. His hand, which had been resting casually on the armrest, clenched involuntarily. Amelia Brooks. The name echoed in his mind, instantly linked to the face, the figure, the quiet dignity of the woman who had been sitting beside him just minutes ago. Couldn't be. He whipped his head around, looking towards the front of the plane, towards the closed door of the cockpit. His eyes were wide, a mixture of disbelief and dawning horror replacing his earlier smugness. Passengers around him were also reacting, murmuring amongst themselves, looking surprised by the captain's name and perhaps connecting it, as Jack had, to the scene that had unfolded in the cabin. The plane surged forward, accelerating down the runway with immense power. The force of the takeoff pressed Jack back into his seat. He barely registered it. His mind was reeling. The woman, the black woman he had insulted, questioned, and dismissed, was the pilot, the captain, the person in control of this massive machine soaring into the sky. It was unthinkable. It contradicted everything he had assumed, everything his ingrained prejudices had told him. As the aircraft climbed steadily, banking gently, the initial shock began to give way to a wave of intense, burning embarrassment. His face felt hot. A bead of sweat trickled down his temple. He reached up, pretending to adjust his glasses, using the movement to wipe the sweat from his forehead. His breath hitched in his throat. The confidence, the authority he had projected just moments ago, completely evaporated, leaving behind a hollow feeling in his gut. He stole glances at the passengers near him, wondering if they were looking at him, if they had made the same connection he had. He felt exposed, ridiculous. His body language was no longer rigid confidence, but a slumped, almost defensive posture. He wanted the floor to swallow him whole. After the initial climb, the aircraft leveled off. The seatbelt sign pinged off. A few passengers began to stir, reaching for magazines or adjusting their seats. But in Jack's section, the tension, though slightly subsided from the peak of the announcement, still lingered. Then the cockpit door, that solid barrier between the passengers and the flight crew, slowly, deliberately began to open. All eyes in the forward cabin seemed to turn towards the opening. Jack's gaze was fixed on it, a morbid fascination holding him captive. Who would emerge? Surely not, but it was. The woman, the very same woman who had been sitting in 2A. She stepped out of the cockpit, no longer in her business suit, but in the immaculate uniform of a commercial airline pilot. The crisp white shirt, the dark trousers, the 4 gold bars on her shoulders signifying her rank as captain. On her chest, a name tag gleamed under the cabin lights. Captain Amelia Brooks. Her face, while maintaining a professional calmness, held a quiet power, a dignity that was undeniable. She walked down the short aisle of the first-class cabin, her steps even and confident. She wasn't hurrying. She wasn't looking away. She met the eyes of the passengers she passed, offering a small, polite nod. It was a routine post-takeoff check, a chance for the pilots to briefly stretch or interact with the crew. But today, for Jack, it felt like a walk of judgment. As she approached the second row, her gaze settled directly on Jack. She didn't stop. She didn't smirk. She didn't offer any overt sign of triumph. Her expression remained composed, professional. But in her eyes, there was a depth, a knowingness, a quiet strength that spoke volumes without a single word. It wasn't vengeful, but it was certainly impactful. She spoke, her voice the same one from the intercom, calm and steady, directed specifically at him. "Good morning, Mr. Rowley. Thank you for trusting me to get you safely to Washington." She didn't linger. The acknowledgement was brief, pointed, and devastating in its simplicity. She gave him a final, unreadable look, a look that seemed to see right through his badge and his bravado to the flawed man beneath, and then she continued her walk towards the main cabin, perhaps heading to the lavatory or speaking with the cabin crew. Jack was utterly stunned. He was frozen in his seat, his earlier flush of embarrassment intensifying to a burning heat that spread down his neck. The air felt thick, suffocating. He could feel the weight of unseen eyes on him, even if no one was explicitly staring. His jaw slackened slightly. He could only stare after her retreating figure, the image of her in that pilot's uniform seared into his mind. His carefully constructed world of assumptions and judgments had just been spectacularly demolished on a stage of plush seats and polished tray tables. He was speechless, humbled in the most public and mortifying way possible. The confident, upright posture of moments ago was gone, replaced by a slump of shock and shame. His hands, no longer tightly clenched, lay limply on his lap. The immediate shock began to recede, leaving behind a profound sense of disquiet. The woman's words, her calm demeanor, her undeniable position of authority on this flight, relentlessly hammered away at Jack's preconceived notions. As the plane cruised smoothly at 35,000 feet, with the world a distant, hazy blue below, Jack was trapped in his own internal landscape, a landscape suddenly fraught with uncomfortable truths. His mind, the trained instrument of investigation and recall, turned inward. He found himself replaying not only the humiliating scene that had just occurred, but also other moments, fragments of memory that he had long compartmentalized or simply dismissed as part of the job. These memories, once filed away under routine interactions or necessary assertiveness, now resurfaced with painful clarity. He saw faces of people he had judged, interrogated, or apprehended, faces that were predominantly darker than his own. He remembered the young woman, barely out of high school, terrified and crying, insisting she was innocent of a petty theft simply because she fit the description. He had been rough with her, impatient, convinced of her guilt based on nothing more than a grainy security photo and her race. He could still see the fear in her eyes as he pushed her into the back of the patrol car, ignoring her pleas. His body language then had been aggressive, dominant, using his physical presence and authority to intimidate. He remembered the older gentleman, neatly dressed, jogging at dusk in a wealthy suburban neighborhood where crime had been reported. Jack had pulled his car over, lights flashing, ordered the man to the ground at gunpoint. The man's confusion and fear were palpable. Jack had barked questions, his voice sharp, accusatory. The man had shown identification, explained he was a resident visiting family. There had been no crime, no connection to the report. But Jack had held him there, face down on the pavement, for 10 long minutes, his knee in the man's back, simply because he looked suspicious, which, in Jack's subconscious calculus, meant a black man in a white neighborhood at night. His body language had been one of absolute control, physical dominance meant to instill fear and compliance. These weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a pattern, a casual, ingrained prejudice that had become so natural he barely recognized it as prejudice at all. It was just how things were, how you had to operate to stay safe, to maintain order. He had seen people like the woman in 2A through a lens of suspicion and stereotype. They were potential suspects, potential problems, never potential captains of multimillion-dollar aircraft. The memories washed over him, each one a small, sharp stone adding weight to the burden of his shame. His posture in the seat became more hunched, his gaze fixed on the window, but his eyes unfocused, seeing only the ghosts of his past actions. He ran a hand over his face, a gesture of weariness and regret. Meanwhile, just a few feet away, behind that closed door, Captain Amelia Brooks was simply doing her job. The successful takeoff, the smooth climb, the establishing of cruising altitude, these were routine procedures, executed with the precision and calm authority of years of rigorous training and experience. As the autopilot engaged and the immediate demands of flying lessened slightly, she chatted briefly with her first officer. The conversation was professional, focused on the flight details, but perhaps it meandered momentarily towards personal reflections. Amelia's journey to this cockpit had been long and arduous, a testament to sheer will and unwavering determination. Born and raised in the tough, underserved neighborhoods of South Chicago, the idea of becoming a pilot had seemed like an impossible dream, as distant as the stars. The financial barriers alone were immense, but even more daunting were the systemic obstacles, the invisible walls built of prejudice and low expectations. When she first applied to flight training programs, she faced outright rejection. She remembered the cold, dismissive words, the condescending tone. "We're not really recruiting women right now, especially women of color," or the more subtle, but equally damaging pronouncements about her not having the potential or the right background, coded language she understood all too well. People looked at her, saw her skin color, her gender, her address in South Chicago, and decided she couldn't possibly possess the intelligence, discipline, or capability required to command an aircraft. She was often met with skepticism, patronizing smiles, or outright scorn. The taunts from some, the casual dismissal from others. "Look at that black girl, thinks she can fly up there with the birds," were constant, a low hum of negativity she had to constantly push through. But she refused to let their limitations define her. She wouldn't accept their narrow vision of her potential. If the prestigious flight schools were closed to her, she would find another way. She enrolled in smaller, less-known programs, training on older, sometimes rickety planes that required more skill and finesse to handle. The hours were brutal. She worked 3 part-time jobs simultaneously, waiting tables in a diner, cleaning offices late at night, doing whatever she could to scrape together enough money for tuition, flight hours, and basic living expenses. There were days she was so exhausted she could barely keep her eyes open, days when the weight of the struggle felt unbearable. She stumbled, she doubted, but she never stopped putting one foot in front of the other, never stopped looking up at the sky. Every hour in the cockpit, every past exam, every challenge overcome was a small victory, a step closer to her goal. She wasn't just learning to fly. She was proving them wrong, one flight at a time. She excelled in her training, not just meeting the requirements, but exceeding them, driven by a fierce inner fire. The hard work paid off. She accumulated the necessary flight hours, earned her licenses, and finally, after countless applications and interviews, she landed a position with a major airline. The climb through the ranks had its own challenges, its own subtle and not so subtle forms of resistance, but she persevered, letting her skill and professionalism speak for themselves. Today, sitting in the captain's seat of this very flight, she was not just Captain Amelia Brooks, a pilot doing her job. She was a symbol, the first black female captain for one of the nation's largest airlines. Her journey was a testament to resilience, a powerful counter-narrative to the very prejudices Jack Rowley embodied. She hadn't just reached her dream. She had shattered a glass ceiling made of skepticism and systemic bias. For her, being in this cockpit wasn't just about a career. It was about proving that potential has no color, no gender, no zip code. It was a message delivered not just through words, but through action, through achievement. Back in his seat, lost in his uncomfortable reflections, Jack could almost feel the weight of Amelia's journey. The sheer effort it must have taken for her to get to that cockpit against the very forces he had, unknowingly or knowingly, been a part of perpetuating. His own easy path, his assumed authority, seemed hollow in comparison to her hard-won achievement. The man who had spent his career enforcing boundaries and limitations, often based on prejudice, was now being transported safely and expertly across the country by someone who had systematically dismantled those very boundaries to reach her position. The irony was a bitter pill to swallow. The smooth flight, a testament to Amelia's skill, served only to deepen his internal turmoil. He was safe because of the very person he had so easily, so cruelly dismissed. The journey was drawing to a close. High above the sprawling urban landscape of Washington, D.C., Captain Amelia Brooks began the intricate process of bringing Flight 714 back to Earth. The cabin lights brightened slightly, and the familiar voice of the flight deck announced their imminent arrival. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your flight deck again. We are beginning our descent into Washington, D.C. At this time, please ensure your seatbelts are securely fastened and your tray tables are stowed." In Seat 2B, Jack Rowley remained still, the internal turbulence of the past hour far exceeding any minor bumps the aircraft might encounter on its approach. The smooth professionalism of the flight, the undeniable skill of the pilot he had so casually demeaned, had stripped away layers of his self-certainty. He looked out the window, not with the keen eye of an agent arriving for an important ceremony, but with the distant gaze of someone grappling with a sudden, uncomfortable shift in perspective. The familiar landmarks of the city appearing below held none of their usual significance. His mind was consumed by the stark contrast between his ingrained assumptions and the reality personified by the woman in the cockpit. His body language was subdued, his shoulders less square, his gaze downcast when flight attendants or other passengers passed by. The aircraft configuration changed, the whine of the landing gear deploying, the subtle vibration as the flaps extended, increasing drag and lift for the slower approach. The ground rushed up to meet them. Through the window, the runway materialized, a long gray strip waiting below. The final moments before touchdown were filled with a familiar tension. A collective held breath from the passengers, offset by the steady, authoritative voice from the flight deck guiding the machine down. Then, the satisfying reality of solid ground. The wheels of Flight 714 met the runway with a firm but smooth thud, a testament to the pilot's skill. A collective sigh of relief, audible throughout the cabin, was followed almost immediately by the spontaneous burst of applause. It began in scattered pockets, then spread, a genuine expression of gratitude from the passengers for a safe flight. Jack did not applaud. He sat motionless, his hands resting in his lap, his face still etched with a mixture of shame and deep thought. The applause felt distant, a sound from a world he momentarily felt disconnected from. He was too preoccupied with the internal echo of his own prejudiced words and the powerful, silent rebuttal delivered from the front of the plane. His body was still, but his mind was racing, processing the events of the last hour. The plane taxied towards the gate, the roar of the engines subsiding into a low rumble. The flight attendants announced that they would soon be at the gate, and reminded passengers to remain seated until the aircraft came to a complete stop. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted from anticipation of landing to the impatience of arrival. The rustle of bags being retrieved from overhead bins. The click of seatbelts being released prematurely. Jack remained seated until the jolt that signified the engines powering down completely. He took a slow, deep breath. The air in the cabin felt different now, charged with the residue of his humiliation and the quiet power of Amelia's presence. He stood up slowly, retrieving his single carry-on bag. He didn't join the immediate throng pushing towards the exit door. Instead, he turned and walked deliberately towards the front of the cabin, towards the cockpit door. His steps were measured, a certain reluctance in his posture, a stark contrast to the confident stride with which he had boarded. Amelia Brooks was standing just outside the open cockpit door, a composed figure in her uniform, offering polite, professional farewells to the disembarking passengers. A flight attendant stood nearby, assisting. Amelia smiled, a genuine, warm smile now that her piloting duties were complete, occasionally exchanging a brief, pleasant word with the passengers as they filed past. As Jack approached, the flow of passengers momentarily thinned. He stopped a few feet from where she stood. They were face to face again, but this time the dynamic was completely reversed. The air crackled with unspoken history, the weight of his earlier behavior hanging between them. A significant pause stretched, a pocket of silence amidst the gentle hubbub of deplaning. Other passengers glanced curiously at the two figures standing still by the cockpit. Jack's body language was tentative, unsure, a complete departure from his earlier bravado. Jack looked at Amelia, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time, seeing past the color of her skin, past his assumptions about her origin or status. He saw the strength in her eyes, the quiet dignity, the undeniable capability that had safely flown this plane. Swallowing hard, he finally spoke, his voice low, a little rough, barely audible above the sounds of deplaning. It was an admission not just to her but to himself. I was wrong. Amelia met his gaze. Her expression remained calm. She didn't gloat. She didn't demand an elaborate apology. She simply nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement of her head. But that nod contained multitudes. It was an acknowledgement of his words, a quiet acceptance of his admission, and perhaps a silent confirmation that yes, he was wrong. It wasn't an absolution, but a recognition of a moment of truth. She didn't need his apology to validate her. Her achievement stood on its own. Her body language remained open, receptive, not defensive. Jack felt a wave of relief, mixed with the lingering sting of shame. That simple nod, free of judgment or malice, disarmed him more effectively than any angry retort could have. He lowered his voice further, his next words a quiet confession, a raw, honest acknowledgement of his past actions, prompted by the mirror her grace had held up to him. Jack, barely a whisper, "Thank you for not pushing me off the plane like I did to so many others." It was a confession of his own cruelty, his own abuse of power, directly contrasted with her choice not to retaliate, not to use her momentary position of power to humiliate him further. It was the deepest apology he could offer, an acknowledgement that he understood the harm he had caused, and that she had shown him a different, better way. Amelia offered another slight nod, her eyes holding his for just a moment longer, conveying a depth of understanding that transcended words. Her acceptance wasn't just of his apology, but of the complex, difficult journey of confronting prejudice. Jack's shoulders relaxed slightly, the tension easing, though the weight of his realization remained. He nodded back, a gesture of respect he hadn't shown her before, and then, his steps slower, more reflective than when he had boarded, he moved towards the exit jet bridge. The self-satisfied swagger was gone, replaced by a quiet humility. Moments later, Captain Amelia Brooks walked out of the jet bridge and onto the tarmac, the open expanse of the airport stretching around her. The bright Washington sunlight glinted off the wings of the aircraft and illuminated her face, now softer, more relaxed than it had been in the cockpit. She pulled off her cap for a moment, letting the warm air touch her skin, a brief respite after the intensity of the flight. She was a figure of quiet strength and accomplishment, a symbol of barriers broken. Near the gate area, waiting for arriving passengers, stood a family. Among them was a little girl, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, her eyes wide and bright with the wonder of the airport environment. She had bouncy pigtails and a curious, open face. When she saw Amelia in her pilot's uniform, looking so capable and commanding, the little girl's eyes widened even further. She tugged on her mother's sleeve. Then, unable to contain her excitement, she darted forward a few steps, looking up at Amelia with pure awe. Little girl, voice full of wonder. "Are you a real pilot?" Amelia stopped, a warm smile spreading across her face. She bent down, crouching slightly so she was closer to the little girl's eye level, connecting with her directly. Her body language was open, welcoming. "Yes, sweetheart. I am a real pilot." She looked into the little girl's bright, hopeful eyes that held so much potential, so much possibility. She thought of her own difficult path, the obstacles she had faced, and the importance of representation, of showing the next generation what was possible. "And if you want to," she said, her voice gentle but firm with conviction, conveying a powerful message of encouragement, "you'll fly even higher." The little girl's face lit up with a brilliant smile, her eyes shining. She giggled, a joyful sound that seemed to echo the boundless potential of a future free from the limitations of prejudice. It was a simple exchange, but it was profound. It was the passing of the torch, the quiet inspiration from one generation to the next, a living embodiment of the story's core message about breaking barriers and dreaming big, regardless of who you are or where you come from. Behind them, another plane was already being prepared for its next journey, symbolizing the endless cycle of travel, of new beginnings, and of the ongoing human effort to reach new heights. The flight has landed, the passengers have disembarked, and for one man, the journey within has just begun. The story of Captain Amelia Brooks and Agent Jack Rowley is a powerful reminder that surface appearances can be deceiving, and that true strength and capability often reside where we least expect them. It shows us the corrosive nature of prejudice and the quiet, transformative power of grace and achievement. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about the judgments we make or the battles others have fought, please consider leaving a like and sharing your thoughts in the comments below. Your engagement helps these meaningful narratives reach more people. And if you wish to continue exploring compelling stories of human resilience, unexpected twists, and the complex tapestry of life, be sure to subscribe to our channel. We have many more journeys to take together, many more layers of the human experience to uncover. Join us for the next story, the next flight, the next lesson.